I'm particularly interested in the NEM is probably one of the most vital drivers of economic productivity in the Australian economy. And I'm interested in if the current policies, market and system rules are set to optimise that economic benefit to the economy. And the effect of the transition to a net zero economy and its effect on the NEM, or as the NEM is planned for in the ISP, raise some questions in my mind as to the economics underlying the decisions on investments being made. In the ISP, it used to set a process, or the market rules, I think, is probably better articulated at. Once a project was indicated as wanting to move forward, it started going down the process of RIT-T, a regulatory investment test for transmission. And that was a multi-part process to do that. Prior to the ISP and AEMO being given the powers to make projects actionable and therefore have to be constructed, AER had a role in part of that assessment process, didn't you?
That's correct.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So prior to the integrated system plan, large transmission projects would generally have been identified through either the transmission annual planning report that the transmission companies produce, or potentially through what AEMO and before that NEMCO used to call the National Transmission Network Development Plan.
Yep.
And when a business would come to the AER with its 5-year revenue determination, those projects might not have been at a place where they were ready to be approved, and so they'd be identified through that revenue determination as a potential contingent project application, so something that might happen before the next 5-year regulatory determination. And the AER would stipulate a number of triggers that would have to be met before a contingent project could come to the AER for assessment. Mm-hmm. And one of those triggers one of them was the successful completion of the RIT-T. Another one was often what we would call a 516.6 determination. So that referred to an old clause in the National Electricity Rules, which was 5.16.6. And in that 516.6 provision, the AER was able to make a determination basically on whether a preferred option was the option that essentially maximised the net economic benefit under the RIT-T. And so those two things used to be triggers that would sit within the contingent project applications, and so when one of them came to us, we would issue a 516.6 determination. So we'd look at the RIT-T and we would confirm whether or not the preferred option satisfied and maximised the net economic benefit. So, but with the introduction of the integrated system plan, my recollection is I think 516.6 was removed from the rules in about April 2020. Yeah.
So it's sat as part of the RIT-T, because that has, I believe, 3 steps: a PADR, PACR, and then a feedback loop?
No, so this was before the ISP, so there was no feedback loop then. It was just, there used to be the project specification consultation report, then there was the project assessment draft report, right. Then there was the project assessment conclusions report. So they were the 3 steps of the RIT-T. Once that RIT-T had been done, and so one trigger was that had to happen, yep. And then a separate trigger was that the AER had to effectively issue. So the business would have to come and ask for a 516.6 determination, which we would make, and that would be how the projects could then proceed to contingent project application.
And that 516.6 was an economic assessment rather than just a cost assessment. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator. So we would, at the time, we would make a determination about whether the preferred option that had been identified in the RIT-T was the option that would maximise the net economic benefits.
Net economic benefit for the country or for
the electricity system. Yes,
sorry?
For the electricity system.
For the electricity system. But it was an economic rather than just a cost one.
Yeah.
With the change... post-Finkel review, the ESB came in and then against Finkel review's recommendations, said that AEMO had the power to make transmission projects actionable. And that power or that step, or the word actionable, effectively means it has to be built. Is that correct?
So it's interesting. I did listen to a little bit of the session this morning, not all of it, and I heard you ask AEMO about this, and I was trying to see if I could remember, because I was on the Energy Security Board at the time, and in fact I think Senator Canavan would have been in a lot of those meetings. You were Resources Minister then, I think.
Yeah, I wish I had more influence.
And so I think from memory, actually, the COAG Energy Council directed the ESB to make the integrated system plan actionable. And so I think there's a communique. I didn't have time to check, but I'm pretty sure there was a communique from around that time. And so, when the Energy Security Board was then tasked with coming up with a set of rules to make the integrated system plan actionable, that's what we were directed to do by ministers in their response to the Finkel review.
And that was, if you read the media around it, etc., that was to shorten the time of approvals. Some people express views that the 516(6) took a long time.
That's correct, yeah. And I became chair of the AER before those rules were actually agreed, so I sort of switched hats in the middle. But certainly there was a concern that the transmission approval process was taking a long time, that 3 stages were unnecessary, and particularly that first project specification consultation report, that some of that very early work could be done in the integrated system plan. And so that when the integrated system plan was complete, projects that where there were candidate options identified in the integrated system plan could move straight to that second stage of the RIT-T. And another element of it was to remove the AER's 516(6) assessment. And put the feedback loop in, I should say. Yeah.
And do you think system planning and the system that we're ending up with is more? Do you think there's a risk that it's becoming less economically efficient and productive with the removal of that 516(6)? Because now there isn't an economic assessment done of projects, is there?
Well, the economic assessment of the project that's done now is the integrated system plan and the feedback loop. So the feedback loop replaced effectively the 516(6). There is still the RIT-T, and the RIT-T is obviously a cost-benefit analysis. And so I think the view is that between having the integrated system plan, which is a cost-benefit analysis at the beginning, then the more detailed work on the regulated investment test for transmission, which has 2 stages to it, and then it going through the feedback loop again for a further economic assessment and testing, that a 516(6) in that context was redundant.
But none of those steps are now, post that rule change, are an economic assessment.
All of those steps are?
No, they're a cost-benefit analysis. There's a big difference between a cost-benefit analysis and an economic assessment.
Can you help? I just want to understand how you're making that distinction. So what are you saying is in an economic assessment that's not in a cost-benefit assessment?
Well, a cost-benefit analysis just says, do the costs outweigh this in a system? An economic analysis looks more broadly and says, are there other ways to achieve this need? Does this project meet the need in the most economic way?
So I should probably clarify then. I think when we were doing the 516(6) assessments, it was a cost-benefit assessment. It was looking at different ways of delivering the project and doing economic modelling to determine that, but it was still only looking at costs and benefits within the electricity system. Yeah. So
you wouldn't look at whether, just an example off the top of my head, a transmission project was more or less efficient than a non-network solution to the problem?
Oh no, that would be, but that would be included now too. So they are required under the rules to consider both network and non-network solutions. It's one of the reasons the RIT-T still exists, is because it's hard for the integrated system plan at that very macro level to identify non-network solutions. But the transmission companies, when they do the RIT-T, they are meant to look at both network and non-network solutions. Did you want to add to that? I can see you nodding, Steph.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really critical thing that the RIT-T contributes. The ISP has identified a need and a candidate project to meet that need, but in carrying out the RIT-T for that actionable project, the proponent needs to test the credible options for meeting the need. So that needs to include the option that's in the ISP, but they also need to look at all of the other credible options for meeting that need, which could include non-network solutions. It could include different ways of delivering a network solution, and that's what you see in RIT-Ts. So in the HumeLink RIT-T, for example, they had a range of network options in particular. They were the top 3. They involved different sort of capacity lines running from different locations, but fundamentally they were looking across all of those. What are the relative costs and benefits of them? They must then identify as their preferred option the one which has the greatest net benefit out of all of the ones that they identify.
Sure, but you said that they looked at line options or etc. I can't remember, and I've not read every PADR, but I can't remember seeing non-networked options assessed in the same way that transmission options would be.
In smaller ones you would. So when you see some of the smaller RIT-Ts, they might have, for example, battery solutions, or they might tender for opportunities. I mean, I can think of one in particular, Broken Hill is what I'm thinking about. So there's a Transgrid did a RIT-T for the system in Broken Hill, and actually the preferred option was a non-network solution. So it's compressed air storage from memory. But so there are examples of it. Probably you're less likely to see the non-network solutions get up in very big infrastructure projects. Were you looking to say something? No.
And that's interesting in of itself when you then look at a project such as VNI West. Now, as I put to AEMO earlier, large-scale transmission, let's call them interconnectors rather than just transmission to differentiate, in Australia, or particularly in the NEM, don't have much, if any, economic benefit going for them. Interconnectors are meant to either temporarily spread supply or load, geographically, where there's massive differences in solar or wind resource from one to the other, and there's a third one that escapes me right now, but I'll come back to that. So the economic benefit for large-scale transmission or interconnectors is pretty tenuous, particularly given the huge amount of cost, plus cost to environment, social licence, communities, all the other things. You look at a project such as VNI West, where the economic justification for it was that it would stop Victoria having to build pumped hydro somewhere in there, because it could import energy from batteries in New South Wales.
And snow hydro, yeah.
And that makes absolutely zero sense, because there's no argument that Victoria could just as easily build batteries and have its own energy supply from those, as opposed to having to import it from New South Wales.
My understanding was, and Steph might want to add to it though, that it was less about storage from batteries and more about storage from the Snow 2.0 project.
Yeah. Yes.
I'll be interested to hear more on that. I'll notice if you care to.
So I think the identified need would go to that. Have we got the identified need for the VNI West project?
Let me pull that up for you.
We can keep going, but
Sure.
Steph will have a look. And
So now that you no longer do 516.6, you are responsible for assessing the contingent project application. Am I right in characterising that as basically just looking at the costs, seeing if they're reasonable and seeing if they add up?
yes, I mean, the thing I would still say is there's still 4 triggers that need to be met for us to do a contingent project application decision. So the first one is still the successful completion of the RIT-T. The other ones are that there's no disputes on foot, that it's been the identified need is met by the preferred option confirmed by EMO through the feedback loop, and that the costs haven't escalated to a point where they wouldn't pass the economic assessment of the feedback loop. So those 4 hurdles still have to be met before we can go through a CPA. And, you know, if there's been a dispute raised on any of those elements of it, we would hear that dispute as well and may need to form a view in the event of a dispute. So you're right in the sense that the CPA assessment itself is just a cost assessment. Is this cost reasonable for building this project? But you would see, for example, you know, when HumeLink came to us, one of the things that they had to do was what was called, the onus is on a project proponent to form a view about whether or not there's been a material change in circumstances. And given there had been quite a large change in the cost of HumeLink from when it first was conceived and did its RIT-T to when the contingent project application came to us, we wrote to Transgrid in August 23 and said, hey, don't forget about this obligation. You may need to consider whether there's been a material change in circumstances. They did that analysis. They provided that to us with the completed RIT-T. We put that out for consultation as we consulted on the contingent project application and heard from quite a number of stakeholders that they didn't feel confident in that material change in circumstances analysis. And so we commissioned our own economic modelling to test the robustness of that material change in circumstances analysis. So we sort of have a role, but it tends to come in more as part of those triggers and in the event of a dispute rather than an enshrined role like we did before. Did you want to add to that, Justin, at all?
No, I think that's essentially right. I think the other point, just to be clear about the 5.16.6 review, is that it was essentially a review of the RIT-T process that had been undertaken. It wasn't a wider test, because I think, Senator, I may have heard you describe that as an economic test. But essentially it would be the TNSP undertakes the RIT-T, is our preferred option. If it were to come to us under 5.16.6, it would be to confirm that the preferred option under the RIT-T was in fact the preferred option under the RIT-T. So we're essentially reviewing that work that had been done. It wasn't a wider or different test.
And if there is a material blowout in cost, and that's confirmed, the proponent would have to go back and restart the RIT-T process, is that correct?
Not necessarily. So if there's been a material change in circumstances, now the requirement is they would have to tell us, produce a report, here's what happened, here's what we might do. One possibility of that review might be to say you need to go back and do it again, but there might be other ways to deal with it, to do further modelling to see whether, in fact, it would still be the preferred option. So costs and benefits can change without necessarily changing the ranking of options.
And under a rule that AEMC put through in October 2022 about a material change in network infrastructure project costs, that rule itself says that a proponent of projects with an estimated cost greater than $100 million to develop reopening triggers. So the proponent themselves develop their own reopening triggers?
So I might get Steph to respond to this, but that rule actually wasn't in place when we did the HumeLink letter. That's why we wrote to them in the first place, because we were trying to sort of strengthen the arm a little bit on that question. Right. And I think that rule change did recognise that there was probably insufficient guidance on what in a project proponent's view meant. we've given further guidance on that in our guideline, haven't we?
Yeah, we have. And it's really about being transparent around what those reopening triggers are, so that, all stakeholders have the opportunity to understand them, to comment on them, to, I guess, keep track of how the project is progressing relative to them. And that's done up front throughout the project, rather than having a conversation at the end about what makes something material or otherwise.
Given such a huge increase in project costs, are you able to provide the committee with whatever assessment you did that said that this was still a project that economically made sense to go forward?
Chris, did we publish our material change in circumstances analysis? I thought we did.
Yeah,
I think it's
It's in
published,
our
so
decision.
we can provide
Okay, that would be great.
Essentially what we did, though, is we looked at, with the other two options that were on the table, so option 3C was the preferred option for HumeLink, but the other two options, they, in our view, had perhaps not given them the benefit of the early works that we'd seen attribute to the option 3C. So we bolstered the benefits, or reduce the costs effectively of the other two options to recognise the benefits of early works. We then got ACIL Allen to do independent market modelling to look at the benefits, because Transgrid had effectively assessed the benefits of option 3C at something like 4 times what the ISP had it at. So we remodelled those benefits and came up with a number that was sort of reasonably consistent with where the ISP was at. But even once you took into consideration lower costs for the other two options and lower benefits for the third option, it still was the option 3C was still the preferred option.
Thank you. AER is responsible for issuing guidelines on how benefits are assessed. Is that correct?
The cost-benefit assessment guidelines,
Yes.
yeah, that's correct.
In the ISP, and I assume this went to some of the benefits in the HumeLink application, there's a remarkable number of benefits that get counted as market benefits in the ISP and in this process. And perhaps you can enlighten me on why some of them exist, because for the life of me I can't understand why. I'm just going to Appendix 6 of the ISP. Give me 1 second.
Someone got Appendix 6 of the ISP.
As counted as market benefits being delivered by the ODP, and this is Figure 1, page 12.
We don't have it in front of us, Senator, so we're going to have to take it.
If you'd like, I can table it, but I think you'll be fairly familiar with it.
If you walk us through it, we should be okay.
I will do my best. In that AEMO count, and this is for the ISP, not for HumeLink in particular, but they count generator and storage capex savings as a market benefit. How is... I failed on it. One, I can't find it in your guidelines anywhere, so perhaps you could highlight for the committee where that exists as a class of market benefit in your guidelines. 2, it's nonsensical to me that when we're trying to reach a target of 82% renewables, we're trying to firm up those renewables with storage, etc. And the fact that transmission neither generates 1 electron, stores 1 electron, or lowers 1 gram of carbon. How is either deferring or cancelling out generator and storage projects a market benefit?
So I'll give you a high-level answer and I'll hand to Steph to fill in the gaps. But essentially the way in which the RIT is done and the ISP is done in a very similar way, and the cost-benefit analysis guidelines are used to guide both of them. We're looking at the costs and benefits that attribute to all those who produce, consume or transport electricity. So that's what the rules require us to do, and so it's almost a closed loop. And in that sense, when you're looking at effectively not spending money on generation or storage, it's avoided capex as well as avoided fuel savings. They are a class of market benefits because effectively we're not spending money on those, but we are obviously spending money on the cost of transmission. So generation and transmission are seen as substitutes in that test, and one can displace the other. But did you want to speak to that, Steph? And Steph has
sorry, before you do, Ms. Jolly. There is enormous differences in economic benefit of generation storage versus transmission. I think we can all agree on that. So how is that, for the good of the energy system and the Australian economy, how is that counted as a market benefit? It is in the closed loop of one particular project. I can understand that. But that's nonsensical in the broader economic sense.
So the way we describe it in our cost-benefit analysis guidelines, which I think is a useful way to think about it, is if you're trying to decide what's the optimal development path for the electricity system, you're looking to maximise the benefits. And so the types of benefits that we're looking for are I guess the change in between one option and another in economic terms, the consumer surplus. So that's the difference between what customers are willing to pay for electricity versus the actual price that they pay. And then on the producer side, the difference between the revenue received and the cost of providing those services. So that's where some of those factors like the cost to deliver a service through one form of generation or another, or one combination of generation and transmission and another, or a non-network solution, become really relevant. And under the rules, there's a big long list of the types of things that form classes of market benefits in that respect. And differences in capital costs between different forms of generation and different solutions is explicitly captured in that list, alongside a whole group of other things like fuel consumption, the timing of when something can be delivered.
I'll come to those ones. But given, certainly for energy consumers, output from generation is dealt with through the market. We all accept a market is a fair and economic way to deal with things. Storage has benefits in and of itself in spreading the amount of electricity available across time. It also potentially has the benefit of displacing baseload coal. It seems like all those are, and transmission has a cost to it, that's going on the back of every one of our energy bills. So explain to me how, in an economic sense, displacing generation and storage is a smart economic move.
I think one of the other things to think about too is the context, and we're going into a period of load growth, but we have obviously been through a period of load reduction, and following privatisation in the early 1990s, as you would well remember, we had a large overhang of
Not the early 1990s, I don't.
No, sorry, but in the late 1990s, that there was a large overhang of generation. And so one of the things when you're thinking about that, the way a RIT-T's done, is if you've got lots of generation, for example, in New South Wales and less generation in Victoria, and you wanted to think about the most economically efficient way of delivering energy for those consumers, if there's excess supply in one region and insufficient supply in the other, rather than building more capacity in the other region and just having even more capacity, a transmission interconnector is a way in which it would potentially increase economic value. So that's that class of benefits. You're asking me to describe how and why it exists. That's how and why it exists. So, and when a RIT-T is done, there is market modelling done with it. So an ACL Allen or a EY Rome, I don't want to plug them all, but they all have, very profitable consulting houses who go out there and do the market modelling of these things, and they test all of these scenarios. So, is it cheaper in aggregate to build just more transmission or to build more generation at centre and load centres? And that's the test that's going on. It's not just an assumption that, well, because there's no molecules or electrons that come from transmission, that there's no value to it. If you're more efficiently sharing resources, there is economic value coming from that. And if you displace the need to invest in new capital expenditure in local areas because you can make more efficient use of what's already there, that's a benefit, and that's why it's captured under the RIT-G.
I'd be interested to see on notice the actual justification of that, of where there is such excess capacity in one region of the NEM versus another that's going to justify that, because I can't say. I admit, yes, there was a historic reason for that.
So just for the purposes of on notice, so you would like us to unpack that 15.38 in generator and storage CapEx savings?
Yeah, or
that might be better put to AEMO because it's their report.
I can do that too, but perhaps it was looked at in the HumeLink application. And my point, I think, is even further strengthened given that the ISP sets out very clearly how much more generation storage we're going to need. I mean, it is perfectly blunt on those points that it's an enormous amount that we're going to need. So again, using another piece of infrastructure to replace that and counting the benefit of that is nonsensical. And I want to hand over the call very soon, but perhaps you could take on notice also the market benefit of fuel cost savings. I assume that means as it displaces coal, those coal costs are saved. I mean, it's an enormous amount, $17 billion. Now, we all know that those fuel costs are going to disappear over time anyway, so I'm not sure how it's a long-term benefit, particularly not out to 2049-50. And the last one is how actionable and future ISP project costs are treated as a market benefit.
Yeah, I think we can unpack that in our question on notice, Senator, but I think the key thing is that it's relative to a base case in which that optimal development path doesn't occur. So it's that counterfactual that these figures are compared to that is creating that sense of market
I didn't
benefit.
get an opportunity to ask AEMO, but I can't find their counterfactual model anywhere in the ISP. If it's in there, it's hidden in one of the workbooks. I did, and thank you for the Deputy Chair. That's exactly what I was trying to do. So if you could take those on notice.
Yeah.
And
if you're okay, we'll answer them as they relate to our functions.
Of course.
I think AEMO will need to explain
I'll do the same ones to AEMO.